good morning, everybody, and welcome to a session to discuss the future of Latin America and its growth trajectory. My name is 𝘿𝘼𝙑𝙊𝙑𝙊. I'm both a columnist at the Financial Times and part of the editorial board. I'm also overseeing King's College in Cambridge, where we have a large collection of Latin American scholars who are very interested in what's happening in the region. Now, I have to be honest and say that when I first started planning for this panel a couple of weeks ago, I thought that Latin America was going to be center stage in a lot of the Davos dialogues, partly because of what the president did in Venezuela. Well, the one thing we've learned as journalists with the president is what happened yesterday. It does not necessarily mean that we know what's going to happen tomorrow. And so this week, it's all about the North Pole instead, which might be a blessing or a curse, depending on how you feel. But the reality is that what the president did in Venezuela has left political risk insurance premiums surging across the area. It's put a lot of focus on where the continent's going in an era of the so-called Donroe Doctrine. It's made it clear that there is growing emphasis on whether or not Latin America can grow or not, because one thing we know is the president really only respects strength and growth. And it's also raised a lot of geopolitical questions about where the region is going as it tries to navigate its relationship with China, which has been deepening in recent years, alongside its relationship with its northern neighbor, and of course the rest of the world. And we've just seen the EU-Mercosur deal signed, which potentially shows that for all of the storm and drama, in fact, trade and trade deals are certainly not dead. In fact, people are looking for alternative ways to create growth in the modern era. So we have a truly fantastic group of people to discuss that with us from different perspectives. On my immediate left, but your right, is 𝘿𝘼𝙑𝙊𝙑𝙊𝙑, who's the Minister of Management and Innovation in Public Services of Brazil, particularly well placed to talk to us about what's happening in Mercosur. We've got next to, I'm looking at the, next to her is Julio Velarde, who's the governor of the Central Bank of Peru, widely acclaimed for his management of the Peruvian monetary system, even amid what might be called some political headwinds and turmoil. Next to him is James Scriven, who's the Chief Executive Officer of IDB Invest in Washington. And next to him at the end is Juan Carlos Mora, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Bancolombia in Colombia. So, combination of perspectives, and later on we'll be joined by the other panelists at the end. But I'm going to start, in fact, with James, because you are an outside observer on the region. I'd like to ask, how do you see the region right now in terms of its growth trajectory? What does it need to do? And then I'm going to turn to the three of you to ask to respond to his advice.
Great, thank you very much. So I'm here representing the IDB Group, the Inter-American Development Bank Group, the largest development institution in Latin America and the Caribbean, and probably related to the question that you're asking, IDB Invest is the private sector arm of the IDB Group. I think what today Latin America is facing, I think it's part of the discussion that we're going to have, is not necessarily macroeconomic stability. I think that has been relatively stable over the last decade. But what we are facing today is other constraints to investments. And let me start by the positive side. Latin America is blessed, Latin America and the Caribbean are blessed by natural resources. If you think about value chains, connectivity with the US and Canada, if you're thinking about critical minerals, if you're thinking about renewable energy, the place to be is Latin America and the Caribbean. So I think there are enormous positives that relate to opportunities that we see. But what has been happening over the decades is other things are worrying investments to come in. So today, for us, the biggest challenge is investment and productivity. And I'm going to refer to what we consider are some of the constraints for that to happen. One, low investments and weak productivity relate to the level of investments that each of us, our countries, the private sector are doing in our economies, way below any of the more developed markets in the world. We've got smaller markets compared to what would be Europe. If you think it as global, you think about Asia. So integrating trade across and within the region is going to be an important aspect for it. The biggest constraint that we're seeing is uncertainty and lack of trust. If you look across the region, one of the biggest constraints that we're seeing is a lot of volatility. In the audience, we have my former boss, Luis Alberto Moreno. When we were traveling to the Middle East, he coined a phrase that I thought was very interesting to this panel. He said, Latin America is not for beginners. And then I think that refers to the complexity of operating in Latin America and the Caribbean. How we can help. And I'm going to refer to our role in particular. Latin America, as other regions, have development institutions. And the biggest constraint that we're seeing is this lack of certainty, mistrust in either law, institutions, currency, you name it. And the interesting part of working with an institution like ours is to try and avoid those risks, mitigating those risks, convincing investors to come into our continent by mitigating those risks. And those risks can be credit related, it could be construction risk if you're thinking about renewable energy, if you're thinking about building roads, airports. There's a concern of construction risk, and we can cover that. But there are many other risks that we see that go to convertibility risk, transferability risk, expropriation. There are a number of complex things that we can work together. And we are moving as an institution into a role that we call originate to share. And the concept of originate to share, different from what would be the originate to distribute in Wall Street or London, it's we bring in investors and we help them navigate the uncertainty of our continent. So those are two concepts that I wanted to share, both where do we see the constraints and how can we help?
Well, thank you very much indeed. That's very useful to frame the picture. And I'm going to ask the three other panelists to react to that. I've put on my headset because Esther 𝘿𝘼𝙑𝙑, I believe, is going to speak in Portuguese. So if any of you are not Portuguese speakers, do please find your headset and get ready to listen to that in just a moment. But while you're finding that, I'm going to start, in fact, first with Governor Velarde and ask you, how do you react to what you just heard from James? Because I said earlier, Central Bank of Peru has done a quite remarkable job, and you've won a lot of acclaim across the continent for maintaining an impressive level of monetary stability, even amid extraordinary political and economic turmoil. So I think many people are asking, how have you managed to do that? But as somebody who's not actually in the government per se, how do you try to frame this challenge of creating some certainty in these uncertain times? And what to you is a key thing needed to create more investment and productivity, as the thought we just heard from James?
Well, thank you for the question. I'm not so sure about, I agree completely with what you have said. It depends on the countries. Actually, Latin America this century has grown a little more than 2%. But had the three bigger economies have grown very little. The other countries had not done so bad, not so good, but not so bad. Mexico grew 1.7%, Brazil a little more than 2%, Argentina a little more than 2%, Peru more than 4%, Colombia, Chile close to 4% actually. So it has not been so different. I'm not so sure about uncertainty. An American producer, he doesn't know what tariff he is going to face for inputs. And somebody that is selling imported consumer goods doesn't know what is going to be the tariff at the end. They has changed more the taxes than other countries. In our case, we have maintained the same rules for taxes to enterprises in 1992. A small change in 2016, but basically the same. Our economy is pretty open. Our tariff is at 0.8. The problem, we trusted in rule of law and the treaties we had signed. We had a treaty with the states. You were talking about Mercosur. We have a free trade agreement with the states that was approved by Congress and supposedly should have been changed only by American Congress. But we have seen we have neutralities. So I don't see if our uncertainty is much higher than other countries. We have had 9 presidents. The exchange rate almost has not moved. It moved 1% one day, then it corrects the next day. The yield of the bonds has been pretty stable. So in spite of the political volatility, actually our growth has not been so bad. So I'm not so sure if that is shared by everybody. Reforms, there are a lot. Of course, one institution, it was mentioned here, macro stability has been here. We have independent central banks. And we have seen very strong critiques to some of these more important central banks. And the governors have continued their independent monetary policy, in spite of the critiques coming from the president. And in spite of some countries having now a little more inflation than before, I would say compared to the 70s, 80s, and even early 90s, the situation is much better. And one of the factors that probably has been behind the low growth of Latin America compared to Asia has been macro instability, 70s, 80s, with these big fiscal deficits, inflation, etc. So the situation is not good, but it's not so bad. Well, we have to build our institutions.
Right.
The presence of the state around the country, better civil service, better education. Some of the countries that had the best education, some of the world actually, now they were in these exams, they have very low grades. And I believe if you have a good educated population, you will be prosperous at the end.
Right.
But you have to invest in that, no? I have talked too much, maybe.
Right. Well, thank you. And you make a very good point about relative policy stability, because people used to look at Latin America as in place of policy uncertainty. And these days, by comparison with others, you're looking like a bastion of predictability in many ways. But I'd like to bring in Minister 𝘿𝘼 at this point, who will be speaking in Portuguese. So do please find your headsets if you don't have Portuguese as one of your many languages. Tell us about Brazil, because you are one of the countries that's been fascinating in relation to your northern neighbour, in that you essentially faced down President Trump in relation to tariffs and the bullying around the tech sector. I wouldn't say you won necessarily, but you certainly did much better than many other countries in terms of not appeasing too much. And of course, you were at the centre of the EU-Mercosur deal. How do you interpret Brazil's challenge around growth at the moment?
Well, first of all, I speak in Portuguese being broadcasted, and so I prefer to say in Portuguese. Então, voltando para português, primeiro agradecer o convite.
Going back to Portuguese, I'd like to thank you for the invitation for being part of this panel. In fact, Brazil has been growing a little more quickly over these past 3 years than before, closer to the world growth rate, something that had not been going on for at least 10 years in Brazil. And this is the result of a combination of policies, including the external Brazilian policy, which has changed a lot with the new Lula administration. Just a brief comment on the relationship with the United States. What Brazil did was to sit and wait and use Brazilian diplomacy, which has always been very prominent. And we talked and we reversed the situation at least to minimum standards, still not ideal, but by means of diplomacy and with a certain degree of calm during the absurd moment of tariffs of 50%. At one point, Brazil was the country with the highest tariffs in the world. We managed to wait and with diplomacy resumed talking to the United States, even at the presidential level, with very good conversations. Regarding the Mercosur agreement, which started more than 20 years ago, at a moment when Brazil already foresaw a polarization between Asia and the United States, we thought that the ideal partner at that time was the EU, and that made concrete when that became something very clear to the world. I mean, the polarization became even clearer, and the agreement with the EU became even more relevant between two blocs that get together at a time when both are under a certain degree of maybe threat, or at least a challenge. What President Lula did when he took office again in Brazil, and I worked in the previous administration, and I'm back now in this third term. It was a combination of the previous terms in a much shorter period of time. In the first two the two first Lula administrations, Brazil started to incorporate new growth dynamics, and they were all organized at the same time. So macroeconomically, we performed some reorganization, which was very important. Fiscally, in the transition period, the government started to rediscuss the fiscal rules in Brazil, which reduced growth, and it was impossible to be complied with. So we reorganized the budget and brought in distributive policies and public investments, which had hit record lows. So we reorganized the budget, and we reorganized the stipend transfer program, and we discussed the fiscal rules. And if we look macroeconomically, we decreased the fiscal deficit very strongly, even with the resumption of income transfer or stipend transfer. And the fiscal deficit was reduced in more than 70% if we adjust this to the real terms at the beginning of the administration. So we reorganized the budget, and we brought back investment policies, and I agree that one of the challenges in the region is to increase investments, and what we have seen in Brazil is that private investment is brought forward by public investments. So we have infrastructure investments with concessions. So macroeconomically, we have decreased the fiscal deficit, we've decreased inflation, and we've managed to have a much more tranquil fiscal landscape, still with challenges. And in terms of growth strategies, there was this combination of the Lula administration's number 1, 2, and Dilma together. We have worked in 5 growth fronts. One, decreasing inequality and redistributing income as a growth engine. And it was not just in spending. Brazil performed a historical feat, which was a fiscal reform in a democratic government, both in indirect taxes. The Brazilian fiscal regime was one of the most complicated, and it's turning into the simplest, one of the simplest ones, and something unimaginable 10 years ago. Even if Brazil had very aggressive taxes, the attempt of reversing that never worked out. And in this term, we have managed to decrease taxes for people who have who make up to, say, $1,000, and to tax more those who make more than R$1 million per year. And this is something new in Brazil, and that was the president's idea, to include the poor people in the budget and the rich people in income tax. So from the expenditure point of view, we have public policies for health and education, generating indirect income for families, the reorganization of the income transfer program, and for industrial and trade policies, we resumed more active industrial and commercial policies. So this combination of factors allows for a new base for growth. And I will stop here because of time, but I think that this is, in fact, is the challenge we have worked with in Brazil.
Right. Well, thank you. That's very helpful indeed and very striking. I'd like to bring in now 𝘿𝘼𝙑𝙊𝙑𝙊𝙎, who has a slightly complicated title, so tell us exactly what you're doing these days. And is going to be speaking on behalf of Mexico. And Mexico has managed to, thus far, navigate the very slippery tightrope of dealing with your northern neighbor pretty deftly and impressively. But tell us how you see the outlook for growth right now with Mexico, because of course we do have a situation where America's trying to suck out a lot of the factories that have been based in Mexico up into the north, which could certainly undermine your growth. And you are under pressure from many sides now. So tell us what you're doing to try and maintain growth.
Thank you. Well, we're excited to be here. So when President Sheinbaum started her campaign in November 2023, she had three main priorities on the regional economic development and nearshoring side. On the one hand, she realized that there was a need to reimagine or transform the relationship that private initiative, academics, and government had of working together. And so she created this business advisory council that I chair, that is part of the economic cabinet and that works very closely together to set industrial policy that can not only spike growth, but also shared prosperity. The second thing, or her second conviction, was that Mexico needed not only a government plan for investment and for growth, but a country plan that had a long-term vision of where we wanted to be and how do we get there. Not only with the infrastructure enablers, airports, ports, freight trains, cross-border transit and whatnot, that give us more competitiveness, but also an infrastructure that gives you welfare, right? Hospitals, schools, et cetera, and that all of these should be in one grand plan that had very specific KPIs, and that was Plan Mexico. She presented Plan Mexico exactly 1 year ago. Plan Mexico is a plan that was built with private initiative, with the academics in Mexico. It has 13 goals. The first one, the last one, are probably the most general and the most ambitious. We want to be one of the top 10 economies in the world. We're currently number 12. And we want to be a country with less poverty and less inequality. The past 6 years, government policies, particularly the raise in minimum wage, have gotten 13 million people out of poverty in Mexico. And the rest of the goals, number 2 to 12, is how we intend to get there. And some of my fellow panelists have already touched on this. But the goal number 2 is we want that 25% of our GDP is investment, at least by 2026.
25%.
25%. And want to pull it up to 28% by 2030, because that's the only way to break the growth barrier, right? But we also want that we are, as you know, one of the top 6 countries with most engineer graduates and STEM graduates in the world. We have more than double than Brazil yearly. We have more per capita than the United States. And we want these graduates to be able to have social mobility and labor mobility. And so we want to link them to specialized manufacturing. We have some challenges on simplification and digitalization of permits. And so there's a specific goal on that. We want investments to be able to land in Mexico, not in 2.7 years like it's right now, but in 1 year by the end of the administration. And this is, we have a new ministry for simplification, which its main job is to cut down federal, municipal, and local permits and to homologue them. And when you look at the rest of the goals, they have to do with dual education programs. They have to do with resilience of supply chains, but they also have to do, and to answer specifically your question, to how we navigate a new world in which both the paradigm of what we consider to be market economy, but also what we consider to be globalization, have fundamentally changed. And where we think Mexico can lead this new wave of both market economies and different way to understand globalization. Mexico is currently #1 producer of heavy-duty trucks, #4 of auto parts, #6 of light vehicles, #4 of medical devices, the only country in Latin America that produces semiconductors, particularly ATP. We're top 10 countries and 17 of critical minerals, or the most strategic minerals in the world. We have enormous potential for energy, and specifically in renewable energies and transition energies. And so with the most sophisticated economy in Latin America, the second most sophisticated in the continent, we believe we have a chance not only to specialize, but also to consolidate. Aerospace industry, also top 9 in the world. And so to do this, there is industrial policy that has 5 principles. The first one's, how do we include people we've never included before? Women, young people, small and medium businesses, and south and southeastern part of the country. 2, how do we become more innovative? Because being top 10 in many specialized manufacturing, we still have long way to go in added value. And so how do we incentivize research and development and technology transfer? 3, sustainability. And being herself a doctor in energy and sustainability, we are very committed not only to an energy transition, but also to water efficiency programs and to communities. How do we impact positively communities through business? 4, digitalization, which is one of her main programs, not only to simplify, not only to homologue, but also to give access to better economic, social, and cultural rights to Mexicans, housing, transportation, and whatnot. And the last one is regional vocations. We recognize that free trade should remain as one of the pillars in the world, but also in Mexico. But we also recognize that for free trade to exist, there needs to be fair trade. And we do celebrate that that policies, even right-wing countries, are looking at trade from a way that says it needs to get better conditions, labor conditions for the working class people. The standard minimum wage of living needs to provide enough quality of life and social mobility. And there needs to be a fight together to eradicate subvaluation, subsidized production, and technical contraband.
Right.
And so that is kind of the policy that we've been following, and we think there are enormous perspectives and we can land this correctly.
Right. Well, it's very interesting because I hear common themes here from all of you about trying to, 1, double down on the fact you have relative policy stability compared to your northern neighbor. Secondly, that industrial policy is back in fashion. And, you know, in some ways it never went away, but now, as the IMF says, the policy that had no name now has a name and people are actually embracing it. Perhaps you're more experienced in some ways in that than others. Thirdly, that as part of that, you are very self-consciously, all of you, trying to adapt to the new reality of the fact that the free market globalization paradigm is no longer dominant. And fourth, that you're looking at things like digitization and inclusion as a very strong theme. So I'd like to bring in now 𝘿𝘼𝙑 and ask you from the perspective of the private sector, and you are the only private sector representative on the panel, does this sound convincing to you in terms of what is actually going to unleash growth? And since, of course, you are uncomfortably close to the recent dramatic events in Venezuela, and because we've seen the risk premium in the markets go up for Latin America on the back of what's happened in Venezuela, how does that impact your outlook for Colombia and the area right now?
Thank you, Jill. Good morning, everybody. It's for me a pleasure to be in this panel. And let me elaborate a little bit on what was being said in this panel, and you commented. You started in your introduction asking if Latin America can grow or not. And I think that's not the right question. The right question is how Latin America can grow more. And James mentioned, and other panelists mentioned, all the assets that Latin America has to grow. And it's natural resources, minerals, industrial policies, Mexico leading Brazil, the big examples in the region that other countries need to follow. And if you analyze this decade, 2020 to now, we started with the pandemic, then the inflation cycle, then there is a lot of volatility on commodities, but the region did fairly well. It's not enough, definitely it's not enough, and that's why, what is the question? How we can grow more than 2%, more than 3%, we need to be growing at least at 5 or 6%. So the question is, why are not growing more than that 3%? The recent forecast of the IMF is 2.2 for the region in 2026. So still, and 2027 again is 2.5, 2.6. So we are not doing that. And the point is that we are trapped in the middle of what a foreign policy magazine calls the new international disorder. We are in the middle of what is going on around the world in geopolitics. It's a region with its own challenges, but we are in the middle. So at the end, what we have to do is how do we have as a region, as the assets that we have, how we can play a role on that international disorder in order to be benefit from that, how the region is going to align or not in the different players. It's the US, it's China, it's both. Probably that's the best way the region to go, how to play, to be not completely aligned, but to benefit from both players in the world. And the private sector, and you said I'm representing here the private sector. The private sector is key, but what we have inside the region is also a political volatility that is creating a lot of barriers for growth. That instability, and James mentioned the lack of trust, the uncertainty about the rules, taxes, if the rules are going to be set for mid and long term, and governments play a key role. And let me say that integration among Latin America is key. There have been several attempts. The Pacific Alliance is one of them, between Chile, Peru, Mexico, and Colombia. If you see it now, it's a failure. But it's the kind of things that we need to do inside region, and private sector could play a role there. I have several fellow private sector leaders understanding that kind of alliances among different countries is key, but we need to have a common ground to do business among the region, and that's not happening because of political instability. But in general, we have a very eager private sector that wants to work with governments to invest. Infrastructure, it's a big opportunity that we need, that definitely, and we heard some examples of how infrastructure could help develop a lot of opportunities in the region. But that work with the government's private sectors and the role that multilateral agencies are going to play in the region is key. And they are having difficult times playing a role. IDB Invest, CAF is also key in the region to integrate and to develop opportunities among the region.
Right. Well, of course, Europe is also trying to work out how it can actually integrate, because these days, strength and collaboration in numbers is absolutely critical, as you say, in this era of new international disorder.
But you asked about Venezuela, and so I am going to pass on that.
Well, I was going to ask you, because very quickly, you say that you're worried about political instability. Are you more worried about internal political instability or geopolitical instability? What is the biggest challenge right now?
If I have to choose, more internal instability. the lack of stable rules, clear tax strategies, and the rule of law in our countries, I think, is key. So right now, I am more worried about internal instability than external instability.
I would like to ask whether our Brazilian and Mexican representatives would agree with that. Are you more concerned about internal instability or international instability?
Ok. Eu entendo a fala dele em dois momentos.
Yes, I understand your position from two perspectives. In terms of Brazil, the external geopolitics aspect is more of an impact because of a series of actions that hinder Brazil, and of course what happened in Venezuela is kind of a threat to the region, and all of that is a bit problematic. But one point that was brought, which means that there was a change in terms of internal political stability, is that before, when there was a shift in government, we didn't have as much of instability. And now, with these changes, sometimes we stop having relationships with other countries. For example, Brazil and Argentina. We now have trade issues. This didn't used to happen before with political shifts. And one point which is important is the integration of Latin America in order for us to have more growth. Now Latin America is less integrated compared to other parts of the world. Perhaps it's similar to Africa, but the internal potential, we have to focus on three areas which we have to integrate. Infrastructure, and we've been working on a project to integrate that infrastructure, but looking more at export corridors and not internal integration. Then productivity, production has to be more integrated, and also social policies have to be better integrated. And that lack of integration, I think, hinders our growth potential. So that aspect is very relevant, in my opinion.
What about from Mexico's perspective? I mean, are you more concerned about international instability than internal instability?
So Mexico has kind of been an outlier in Latin America for the past maybe 20 years or even a bit more in terms of macro stability, right? We have an independent central bank. We have inflation that is very much stable. No, it had gone up in 2021, 2022, as so did in the world, but it has very technical elements to deal with macro stability, particularly at a monetary level and at a fiscal level even. No, we're probably one of the countries that has the best ratio debt to GDP, not only in Latin America, but even the OECD.
Yes,
right?
And the G7. I think you beat the G7.
And if you look at all the other factors, right, we have the second lowest level of unemployment in the OECD. There is macro stability. But that is not to say that it is not a huge challenge and a huge opportunity. And probably, as Minister of Brazil just mentioned, we have a huge opportunity in infrastructure. No, we're currently, yes, the 12th economy, but then number 59 in logistical competitiveness. And so there is a huge bridge you can still walk through if there is mixed investment rules on key infrastructure that we can grow. Obviously, the number two is the coordination that is needed. Being a federation and being, 32 different local entities plus 2,500 municipalities, there is a challenge to align priority towards our key projects. And that has always been a challenge to navigate, particularly for investors. Right. And this is why going digital is particularly important. This is why it's particularly a priority. And number three, and it was also mentioned by Brazil, it was productivity. Mexico has made it a point to change labor laws so that, again, we can increase over 100% our minimum wage in the last 5 years. And this has brought the strengthening of the inner market. It has increased consumption. It has done many good things.
Right.
But it is also key to increase productivity. And
Right.
so added value within the region and what we can do to innovate and to incorporate technology changes will be particularly important going forward.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I've got a lot more questions, but I realize we're almost out of time, and I do want to give the audience a chance to comment or ask any questions, unless there's anything that either of you want to bring in quickly and say before we go. We have a question over here. If you could possibly stand up so the cameras can catch you, that'd be very helpful.
Thank you
And
very
please,
much.
Please keep it very short and very briefly introduce yourself.
We have been talking about innovation, productivity, and many more topics regarding breaking the growth ceiling. So I would like to know, what do you think is the role of technology in each single one of your countries for the coming years?
Well, that's going to be quite a lot of answers. But listen, let's quickly ask if there are any other burning questions over here, and then we'll put them together and let everyone comment briefly for about a minute at the end. We've got a question over here, I think. What about technology and the AI boom?
I'm going to that direction. I represent a Brazilian company that is one of the largest tech company in Latin America so far. So how do you envision to create big techs in Latin America? Technology companies that can promote our vision, values, and culture around the world through technology.
Okay, well, listen, let's keep on that tech theme then. We've only got, unfortunately, about 4 minutes left, so you'll have to be very quick. But perhaps we can start with Brazil, because Brazil, of course, has been in the line of fire when it comes to tech. Can Brazil create its own versions of X or other big tech companies?
Estamos aqui com uma das empresas brasileiras importantes.
Yes, we have an important Brazilian company here. In terms of industrial policies, one of the crucial aspects is digitalization and digital sovereignty. Brazil has been talking about this and how to advance. In our industrial policy, we have 6 priorities, and one of these is specifically looking at technology, both for the Brazilian productive sector, which needs to be more automated, but also in the public sector. We have been working very strongly on fostering Brazilian companies in this area, also establishing partnerships with foreign companies. So this is one of the priorities for industrial policy.
Can Mexico create a big tech?
So Chapter 2 of Plan Mexico is decided on that, specifically on AI, and it also has 4 pillars, as you know. The first one has to do with infrastructure, the second one has to do with education, the third one has to do with industrial policy, and specifically the role that development banks are going to play to accelerate this kind of companies or big tech companies. And the fourth one has to do with how do we bring investments and specialization zones. We've created, on the one hand, the biggest upskilling boot camp of 25,000 people yearly with the 60 biggest companies and hyperscalers in 28 different tracks of AI, starting this January, actually. And they also have a plan for different data centers, the national AI laboratory, digital identity, and stacks. And so, yeah.
You're fighting for it. James, I see you want to come in.
I think there is no question when it comes to the opportunities on technology in Latin America and the Caribbean. If you think about it on the productivity side, if you're thinking about the development angle, integration, technology is the only way in which this can be solved.
Right.
And that's why we particularly have strong investment. We have an entity called IDB Lab that invests in upscaling technology. But I think the biggest competitive advantage that you're going to have now in Latin America and the Caribbean is data centers. I mean, we have access to cheap renewable energy that would create enormous opportunities. Recently in Argentina, there was billions of dollars announced in new data centers. So I do think that those are tremendous opportunities.
Well, we've got about 2 minutes left. I'm going to go 30 seconds
Very
over.
quick. Technology has been playing a key role on Latin America already, and it's going to play definitely a key role in the future. Let me talk about the financial sector. Financial inclusion in Latin America has advanced a lot on top of technology, digitalization, and we have many examples. Fintechs are growing, and we have there a good potential of developing new big companies that is not going to be in the region, but outside the region. We have some examples. So, but we have challenges. I mean, definitely the introduction of new technologies are going to boost productivity, but also we will require upskilling of many workers. That will be a challenge. But Latin America is going to develop or look for opportunities for growth on top of technology.
Right. Governor Velarde, do you have much optimism about the digitization of finance?
Of course, for the world, I would say in 10, 50 years, probably we'll see a different world because of artificial intelligence. I'm not so sure how much we will benefit. I probably will benefit a lot. But it's hard to say now. Probably we need more education in any case. And something pretty important, as we have become older before becoming richer, we have to see how artificial intelligence affects work.
Right.
In a developed country, you can have a basic income. In our case, not. Probably that will not be the case. Probably something that you could do in even agriculture with internet, but not natural resources like mining.
Right.
Probably there will be scarce and you can surrender.
Right.
And finish, I believe.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Very quickly, this has been a fascinating discussion. I'm sorry you've had so little time to talk about this, but the key themes that emerge is that, one, everyone agrees that the growth rate has not been so bad, but needs to be increased. Secondly, industrial policy is back with a vengeance. Thirdly, that in a world of increased turmoil and turbulence, as a middle group, you're trying to navigate both sides. You all agree that you need to hang together and integrate, like Europe has the same challenges. You're all finding it very hard, again, like Europe, unfortunately. And fourth, everyone agrees that digitization is going to be central to this, but no one yet appears to have the magic sauce to actually make it happen. So I'll just finish by saying thank you all very much indeed. Your message is very important right now, and very best of luck in navigating these difficult, turbulent times, which may become even more turbulent after today. So thank you.
Thank you.